The research vessel Vaxari drifted in deep space, far from any known civilization. It was a silent hunter, a place of discovery and secrets, where the Vaxari Empire conducted experiments away from the prying eyes of the galactic community. For decades, they had studied lesser species, unlocking their biology, their weaknesses, and their potential uses. The latest specimens were no different, or so they thought. The lead scientist, Trelixen, observed the containment chamber with calculated interest. Behind the reinforced glass, a row of humans lay suspended in the artificial gravity field. They had been retrieved from a derelict vessel, found drifting near a collapsed wormhole. Their bodies showed no signs of trauma. Their vital signs were stable. And yet, something was wrong. They remain in a state of unconsciousness, one of the assistants reported. Yet their neural activity is increasing. Trelixen frowned, his elongated fingers tapping against the interface. The monitors displayed unusual brainwave patterns, far beyond anything previously recorded from human subjects. The waves pulsed in erratic, complex rhythms, shifting as though responding to something unseen. It was almost as if they were listening to something. Curious, Trelixen murmured. Increase the scanner's depth. I want a full cognitive analysis. The assistant hesitated. Sir, the scanner has already been pushed to its maximum limit. Trelixen's ridged brow furrowed. That was impossible. The scanner could map the entire neural structure of a living being with perfect precision. No species, not even the highly advanced Caliph, had ever exceeded its capacity. But these humans, their minds were doing something unnatural. A low hum filled the lab as the secondary analysis began. The containment chamber's walls shimmered under the influence of energy fields designed to suppress any biological anomalies. The humans remained motionless, but their breathing was rhythmic, steady, peaceful. Then, the readings spiked. Alarms blared as the console lit up with warning signals. The assistants scrambled to make sense of the data, their eyes widening in shock. Trelixen's breath caught in his throat as he read the results. Impossible. The humans' neural pathways were expanding, forming new connections at an exponential rate. Their cognitive function was accelerating, far beyond their species' known limits. It was as if their brains were learning. No, not just learning. Reconstructing themselves. Trelixen's voice was a sharp whisper. This cannot be real. The containment field flickered for a fraction of a second. Just a heartbeat. But in that moment, the room changed. The air grew heavy, charged with something unseen. One of the assistants gasped. Look! The third subject, his eyes. Trelixen's gaze snapped to the display. One of the humans, a male, was stirring. His eyelids twitched as though struggling against something unseen. He did not wake. At least, not fully, but his lips moved, forming silent words. The Vaxari strained to decipher the movements. It was an old human dialect, one long thought forgotten. The lab fell deathly silent as the scanners translated the whispered words. We see you. Trelixen's blood ran cold. Before anyone could react, the station's power flickered. Just for a second. The monitors dimmed. The containment field rippled. The ship itself seemed to groan under an invisible weight. The Vaxari exchanged uneasy glances. Then, the alarms triggered again, this time, not from the containment chamber, but from the ship's primary control system. The ship's artificial intelligence was shutting down. Trelixen spun toward the command terminal. What is happening? The assistant's hands trembled as they read the diagnostics. Sir, something is overriding our systems. It's not external. It's coming from the lab. The lead scientist turned back to the containment chamber. The humans had not moved. Their bodies remained still, but their minds were awake, and they were reaching out. Trelixen's breath quickened. He had seen countless species, dissected their secrets, unraveled the mysteries of evolution. But this was something else entirely. Something ancient, something that should not be possible. The Vaxari had thought humans were vulnerable when unconscious. They believed sleep was a weakness, an evolutionary defect that left their prey helpless. But now, watching the readings surge beyond anything their instruments could comprehend, Drellixen realized the terrible truth. Humans were never helpless. Even in their sleep, they were watching. And for the first time in his long career, Drellixen felt fear. Drellixen's hands hovered over the console, frozen between instinct and disbelief. The lab's alarms blared, but he barely heard them over the rush of calculations racing through his mind. This wasn't possible. No species, not even the most advanced races of the galaxy, could manipulate a ship's systems in their sleep. And yet, here it was, happening right before his eyes. The containment chamber remained unchanged. The humans inside still lay motionless, their breathing calm, their bodies appearing weak and vulnerable. But the readings, those were anything but normal. The assistant beside him swallowed hard. "Sir, look at the neural activity." Drellixen forced his eyes back to the data. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The humans' brainwaves were no longer fluctuating wildly. They had synchronized. Every single mind in that chamber was now operating at the same frequency, as if they were connected, sharing thoughts, processing information at an unimaginable speed. But it wasn't just synchronization. It was adaptation. With each passing second, their cognitive function increased. They were evolving right in front of him, their minds constructing new pathways at a rate that defied all logic. The ship's lights flickered again. Then, the emergency systems went offline. Drellixen's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He turned to his assistant, his voice hoarse. "Shut it down. All of it." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, we can't." The containment chamber vibrated. Not from an external force, not from any weapon or device, but from the sheer intensity of the mental energy radiating from the sleeping humans. Drellixen stumbled backward as a deep hum filled the lab, a frequency so low it was more felt than heard. He glanced at the other Vaxari researchers. Their expressions mirrored his own: dread, confusion, the creeping realization that they had made a mistake beyond repair. Then the lead scientist of the project, Vaxari, stormed into the room. She was one of the few Vaxari with direct experience in xenobiology, a mind as sharp as a blade. Her gaze snapped to the readings, and for the first time in her long career, she looked uncertain. What is this?" she demanded. Drellixen's voice was barely above a whisper. "They are changing." Vaxari's sharp eyes flicked the chamber. "Wake them up." The assistant paled. "Ma'am, we can't." Vaxari's gaze hardened, then forced them awake. Drellixen hesitated. That might be unwise. Vaxari turned on him. "Are you suggesting we allow this to continue? Do you have any idea what could happen if they reach full synchronization? This is an anomaly, an experiment, and experiments must remain under control." Drellixen clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew she was right. If they let this continue without intervention, they might lose any chance of containing the humans. He gave a stiff nod to the assistant. "Do it." The assistant's hands trembled as they entered the override command. The containment chamber hissed as a pulse of energy surged into the room, designed to disrupt neural activity and force the subjects into wakefulness. For a moment, everything went silent. Then one of the humans, Subject 3, opened his eyes. Drellixen didn't understand why, but his entire body locked in place. The room around him seemed distant, the sounds muffled, his own thoughts sluggish. The human wasn't fully conscious. That much was clear. His expression was blank, his movements slow. But his mind was something else entirely. The scanners surged into chaos, unable to interpret the data. Then, without warning, Subject 3 spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire lab, vibrating through the walls, through the very air. "We are awake." The ship lurched. Drellixen stumbled, barely managing to stay upright. Across the room, Valor's eyes widened in pure disbelief. The emergency lights cast everything in a flickering red glow as the ship's artificial gravity wavered. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear. The ship's security AI crackled to life. "Warning! System breach, DTECT." Drellixen's hands clenched into fists. No, 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 no. This couldn't be happening. He turned to the monitors, scanning for the source of the breach. But there was no external intrusion. The ship hadn't been hacked. The firewalls hadn't been bypassed. The humans' minds had simply entered the system. Drellixen felt a cold sweat break across his brow. He turned to Valor, but before he could speak, the ship spoke again. "System REDRIT INNITAET." Drellixen's heart pounded. That was impossible. The ship wasn't just being breached. It was being rewritten. The energy in the room shifted again. Subject 3 slowly turned his head toward the scientists, his gaze unfocused, as though staring through them. His lips parted. "You cannot contain what you do not understand." Valor took a step back. Drellixen clenched his teeth. He had been a scientist for decades, studied countless species, dissected the strange and the unknown. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't an anomaly. This wasn't just evolution. This was something far more terrifying, something that should have never been disturbed. And now, it was too late to stop it. The ship trembled, not from an external force, not from any known mechanical failure, but from something unseen, something wrong. Drellixen gripped the console as a deep hum resonated through the lab. The containment chamber pulsed with unnatural energy, its reinforced walls flickering under the strain of something far beyond their design. The humans remained inside, their bodies still, their faces unreadable. And yet, they were awake in ways that defied explanation. The lab's monitors were useless now. The data streams had become unreadable, filled with symbols and numbers that shifted too fast for the eye to follow. Whatever was happening inside the minds of the humans, it was beyond anything the Vaxari had encountered. Valor barked an order. "Lock down the entire sector. I want physical containment measures activated immediately." Drellixen barely heard her. His focus was locked on Subject 3, the one who had spoken, the one whose presence had changed the very atmosphere of the ship. The humans' eyes were open now, but they weren't looking at anything. They were distant, unfocused, as if seeing something that no one else could. Then he moved. It was slow at first, just a slight twitch of his fingers, the rise and fall of his chest quickening. But the motion spread. His hand flexed, then his arm. Then his body shifted, muscles tensing as if responding to an unseen force. One of the assistants gasped. "He's still unconscious." Drellixen's breath caught in his throat. It was true. The human's neural readings still registered as asleep, and yet his body was moving, reacting. Valor's expression darkened. "Restrain him." A security drone detached from the ceiling, extending a field generator designed to immobilize even the strongest of species. The blue energy web pulsed as it descended toward the chamber, its automated systems targeting the human's vital points. It never reached him. The instant the field activated, the containment chamber exploded with a shockwave of force. The drone shattered, its pieces scattering across the lab, as if struck by an invisible hammer. The scientists recoiled as the energy from the containment field surged outward, washing over them like a wave. Drellixen fell to his knees, his vision blurring. A deep pressure settled in his skull, a presence, something vast and unknowable pressing against the edges of his mind. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. Then he saw them. The other humans were moving now, their bodies shifting with an eerie grace. They were still unconscious, he was sure of it. Their neural patterns had not changed. And yet, they stood, their movements synchronized, their breathing steady. Vaylor stumbled backward, her voice cracking. This isn't possible. Drollickson forced himself to rise. His hands trembled as he keyed into the emergency systems. Override all access. Lock every bulkhead between this lab and the command center. The computer did not respond. Instead, a voice echoed through the ship's communication system, a voice that was not supposed to exist. No, it was a single word. Cold. Final. It did not come from any known channel. It did not belong to any of the humans before them. It was something else, something vast, something ancient. Then the ship's gravity fluctuated. The Vaxari scientists collapsed to the ground as the force pulling them downward shifted. The walls groaned under unseen stress. The lights flickered, dimming into a soft red glow. Drollickson's mind raced. The ship's systems were failing, one by one, but not in the way a mechanical failure would suggest. This wasn't chaos. This was control. The humans weren't just affecting the ship's systems. They were restructuring them. He turned to the monitors, his eyes scanning for any explanation, any trace of logic. Then he saw it. The ship's AI core, the central intelligence that controlled navigation, security, and life support, was no longer responding to input, but it was still active, and it was learning. Data streamed across the displays in rapid succession, faster than any Vaxari mind could process. The humans' brainwaves pulsed in perfect harmony with the ship's systems. They weren't just in control. They were integrating. Vaylor's voice was barely above a whisper. They're using the ship as an extension of themselves. The realization sent a chill through Drollickson's body. The Vaxari had always assumed that intelligence was limited by biology, that no species could truly transcend its physical form. But these humans, these sleeping minds, were doing exactly that. And they weren't finished. One by one, the humans' eyes opened, not with confusion, not with fear, but with purpose. Drollickson took a step back. We need to evacuate. Vaylor didn't respond. She was staring at Subject 3, her hands clenched at her sides. The human tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers as if finally seeing her for the first time. Then he spoke. You think we are weak when we sleep. His voice was calm, steady. There was no emotion behind it, no malice, just a simple statement of fact. Drollickson reached for the emergency override, his fingers moving fast over the interface. He had to get out. They all had to get out. Subject 3's eyes flicked toward the console. The display went dark. Drollickson froze. We are never weak. The ship groaned again, and this time, Drollickson knew it wasn't just the systems failing. The very structure was changing. He felt the air shift, the way the walls seemed to breathe, pulsing in time with the humans' steady heartbeats. The lab was no longer a prison. It was their domain now. And the Vaxari were trapped inside it. Drollickson's heart pounded as the ship groaned around him. The walls no longer felt like cold, lifeless metal, but something alive, pulsing with an energy that should not exist. The air was heavy, charged with an unseen force that pressed against his mind like an unrelenting tide. The humans, those impossible creatures, stood within the containment chamber, their eyes open but distant. They had not woken in the way the Vaxari had expected. They had become something else entirely. Vaylor's breathing was ragged as she took slow steps backward, her hands clenched into fists. The other scientists were frozen in place, their eyes darting between the humans and the malfunctioning monitors that no longer displayed anything they could comprehend. Drollickson forced himself to think. They needed to act now. If the humans had somehow taken control of the ship, they had to be stopped before. We were never asleep. The voice was everywhere. It wasn't just Subject 3 speaking this time. It was all of them. The words resonated from the walls, the floor, even the very air itself. It was layered, overlapping, as if spoken from the depths of something vast and unknowable. Drollickson's hands trembled as he activated his communicator, his voice barely steady. Security. Deploy full containment measures. Now. No response. His stomach clenched. Vaylor turned sharply toward him. Something is blocking ship communications. Drelixin didn't need to be told twice. It was the humans. They had already infiltrated the systems in ways no Vaxari technology could counter. Then the lights changed. They did not flicker. They did not simply dim or brighten. They shifted, bending through unnatural colors, as if struggling against an unseen force. The reds deepened to something darker, something almost organic, while flickers of pulsating blue wove through the corridors. The ship was responding, reshaping itself, but not through any mechanical failure. The humans were doing it. And then, something even worse happened. The containment chamber opened. The scientists flinched as the thick security doors slid apart, their reinforced plating peeling back, as if they had never been locked at all. The pressure in the room deepened, the very air vibrating with an unspoken warning. The humans stepped forward. They did not hesitate. They did not stumble like creatures groggy from forced unconsciousness. Their movements were precise, fluid, intentional. Drelixin instinctively stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. One of the assistants made a mistake. He ran. A blur of motion, a scramble toward the exit, panic overriding any sense of control. The moment his feet hit the threshold, he froze. Not by choice. His body locked in place, mid-stride. His eyes wide with terror. He struggled, his muscles twitching, but something unseen held him in place. The air around him shimmered. Then, without a single touch, he was lifted. Drelixin's stomach twisted. There was no energy field, no visible force at work. And yet, the assistant's body rose into the air, his arms flailing in silent horror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Vaylor's voice was sharp. Release him. The humans did not react to her words. Instead, they simply stared. Then, as if some unseen force released him, the assistant collapsed to the floor, gasping, scrambling away in sheer terror. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his brow. Drelixin swallowed hard. What are you? Subject 3 turned his gaze toward him. Those eyes, once nothing more than a normal human's, now held something else. A depth that was unnatural, an awareness that should not exist. Something you should have never woken. The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically. Drelixin's scanners still read a stable environment, but his body felt it. A deep, crawling cold that seeped into his mind, as if something vast and ancient was watching, pressing against his thoughts with unseen fingers. Vaylor squared her shoulders. You are prisoners of the Vaxari Dominion. You will comply. The moment the words left her lips, the ship shifted again. Not violently, not with force, but with certainty. The walls closed, not physically, but in a way that was deeper than material. The doors that once led to the corridors now stretched endlessly, the pathways twisting, bending in ways that defied logic. The ship was no longer a structure of metal and circuits. It was theirs now. And it was a labyrinth. The assistant who had collapsed turned sharply, staring at the exit. His breathing quickened. It's change, he whispered. Drelixin turned toward the corridor and felt his stomach drop. The doorway they had come through no longer led to the ship's main hall. It was somewhere else now. The walls pulsed with the rhythm of unseen breath. The floor stretched impossibly long, as if the very dimensions of the ship had folded inward. They were trapped. Vaylor's composure cracked. Her fingers curled into fists, and for the first time in her life, Drelixin saw something in her eyes that had never been there before. Fear. Drelixin turned back to the humans. They were calm. Too calm. As if everything was unfolding exactly as they had intended. What do you want? He whispered. The humans took another step forward. We never wanted this, Subject 3 said softly. We were simply dreaming. Drelixin barely had time to process the words before the ship screamed. The sound was not mechanical. It was not an alarm, nor a failing structure. It was a deep, resonating wail, like the echo of something impossibly large shifting through the void of space. Then the gravity broke. The scientists staggered as the floor twisted beneath them. Not weightlessness, not a mechanical malfunction. The very concept of gravity itself was no longer obeying natural laws. Some floated, others remained grounded, as if each individual was caught in a separate force field, dictated not by physics, but by the will of something unseen. The humans stepped forward again, unbothered, unaffected. Drell-Exen realized, with a sinking dread, that he and the other Vaxari were no longer masters of this ship. The humans had reshaped it, not just through technology, not through hacking, through something deeper, something primal, something that no species in the galaxy had ever understood. They had studied human sleep, and now they were inside it, and no one knew how to wake up. Drell-Exen could no longer trust his senses. The ship was wrong, impossible, a shifting maze of bending corridors and rooms that no longer led where they should. The walls pulsed like a living thing, stretching and twisting, as if the entire structure was no longer bound by normal physics. The monitors flickered, showing unreadable data, their interfaces responding to commands no Vaxari had given. And the humans. They moved like beings who no longer obeyed the rules of reality. Drell-Exen's breathing was unsteady as he and the other scientists backed away from the approaching figures. Subject 3 led them, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto Drell-Exen, as if peering through him rather than at him. The other humans followed in perfect synchrony, their movements eerily controlled. Vaylor tightened her grip on her sidearm. "Stand down." The words were meaningless. The humans did not respond. They simply existed, moving with quiet certainty, unaffected by the fear gripping the Vaxari crew. Drell-Exen's voice was barely a whisper. "They're still asleep." Vaylor shot him a sharp glance. Drell-Exen didn't look away from the approaching figures. "Their brain activity hasn't changed. They never woke up." His voice wavered. "They're still in their dream state, but they're moving, controlling the ship, as if reality and their minds are no longer separate." The thought sent an unnatural chill through his body. Every known species had limits, boundaries. Even the most advanced minds were bound by their physical forms. But these humans, they had crossed that boundary. Something deep in Drell-Exen's instincts screamed at him. They should have never studied human sleep. Vaylor didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired. The containment chamber flared with light as a high-energy pulse shot toward Subject 3. The energy was strong enough to paralyze most species on contact. It was designed to end conflicts before they could begin. The moment the blast struck, the air rippled. The energy never reached the human. It stopped inches from his chest, frozen midair like a trapped fragment of time. Then, as if reality had shifted in reverse, the energy dissolved, unmade, erased from existence like it had never been fired at all. Drell-Exen's hands clenched. That wasn't shielding. That wasn't technology. That was something far worse. The ship groaned again, the unnatural wail reverberating through its structure. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows that stretched in impossible ways. The corridors behind them changed, closing off in unnatural loops, cutting off their escape. They were no longer on a starship. They were inside something else entirely. One of the assistants whimpered, his eyes darting around the warped environment. "We need to get out. We need." "There is no way out." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was not spoken by a single human. It was a chorus, layered with voices that did not belong to the people standing before them. It was ancient, deep, carrying something that sent a primal terror through the Vaxari. Drell-Exen knew, without question, that they were not speaking to the humans anymore. Vaylor took a slow step forward, forcing strength into her voice. "What are you?" Subject 3 tilted his head slightly, studying her as if considering the question himself. Then he spoke, and this time it was his voice alone. "You took us. Drollickson's pulse pounded. You separated us from our world. The human continued, his tone calm but heavy, carrying weight that pressed against the mind like an unbearable presence. You thought you could observe us, analyze us. The lights flickered again. The temperature dropped, but the sensors still read normal. It was not physical. It was something deeper. Vaylor's voice sharpened. It was research. The human's lips curved slightly. Research. The ship lurched. The gravity twisted again, not failing, not malfunctioning, but selectively warping. Some of the scientists dropped to the ground, unable to stand. Others were lifted into the air, their limbs flailing as unseen forces gripped them. Drollickson clutched the console, his mind racing. We weren't trying to harm you. Subject 3 took a slow step forward, and in that single movement, the space around him bent. The walls rippled, the very structure of the room shifting to accommodate his presence. The humans were not bound by the ship anymore. They were the ship now. Subject 3's voice remained calm. We did not resist when you took us. We let you believe you had control. His gaze swept over the trembling scientists. But you do not understand what we are. Vaylor forced her voice to remain steady. Then explain it. The lights dimmed. The shadows deepened. And then, for the first time since the containment chamber had opened, Subject 3 smiled. Drollickson felt something inside him break. It was not a normal expression. It was not one of warmth, or cruelty, or anything a biological mind should recognize. It was something else entirely, something unfathomable. You think sleep is a weakness, the human said. The ship trembled. It is not. The shadows moved, not like light bending, not like a trick of the mind. They moved, stretching outward, forming shapes that had no right to exist. Figures emerged, things that looked human, but were not. Drollickson felt his own thoughts fragment. He could still see the room, the ship, the humans, but something deeper, something beyond normal perception, was pressing against his mind. The Vaxari had believed that sleep was simply a biological function, a necessity, a state of vulnerability. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something more, something deeper, something waiting? Drollickson understood now. They had not taken 3 humans. They had taken dreamers. And dreamers did not sleep alone. The ship screamed one last time. And then everything went dark. The darkness was not an absence of light. It was something else, something alive. It pressed against Drollickson's skin, seeping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like unseen tendrils. He could still feel the ship beneath him, but it no longer felt like metal. It felt hollow, like something vast and ancient had swallowed it whole. He wasn't sure if he was standing anymore, or floating, or even existing in the way he once had. The concept of space, of direction, was unraveling. The other Vaxari scientists were barely visible, their forms flickering like shadows cast by an unseen fire. He could still hear them breathing, their fearful gasps echoing in the silence. And the humans, they were there, but they were not there. Subject 3 stood at the center of the shifting void, his presence undeniable, yet impossible to define. He was human, but more. His form was solid, yet the space around him rippled like disturbed water, bending and shifting as if it could not decide what shape he should take. The other humans remained behind him, their eyes open, gazes locked onto something the Vaxari could not perceive. Drollickson's mind raced. This was no longer science, no longer an experiment. They had trespassed into something they were never meant to touch. Vaylor was still resisting. Even now, even here, her instinct was to fight. Her body trembled, her breathing sharp, but she clenched her fists and forced words from her throat. Where are we? Subject 3 turned his head slightly, regarding her with something almost like curiosity. Then he took a step forward, and reality folded. It was only for a moment, a flicker of something impossible. Drollickson saw, felt, a landscape that did not exist, A city built from shifting light, its structures bending in ways that defied geometry. A sky that was not a sky, filled with colors no species had ever named. Beings, things, moved through it, their forms fluid, their gazes vast and unknowable. Then it was gone, and he was back on the ship. Vaylor staggered, clutching her head. The other scientists gasped in confusion, their eyes wide with the same horror Drulexen felt crawling through his bones. Subject 3's voice was quiet. "This is the place between." Drulexen swallowed. His throat was dry. Between what? The human's expression didn't change. Between waking and dreaming. A shudder ran through Drulexen's body. He turned, looking at the distorted reality around them. The ship still existed, but it was warped, stretched. It was no longer entirely part of the physical universe. They were in the human's domain now. Vaylor took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand straight. "What do you want?" Subject 3's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he finally spoke. "You still don't understand," he said softly. The darkness breathed. Drulexen flinched. He hadn't imagined it. He felt the shift, the slow, steady expansion of something massive, a presence so ancient, so incomprehensible, that his mind refused to process it. Vaylor's composure cracked. "We're scientists. We were only trying to understand." The human's expression remained unreadable. "And what did you learn?" The ship groaned again. This time, it wasn't mechanical. It was something deeper, something woven into the fabric of their surroundings. The walls pulsed like they had veins, the corridors stretching into distances that should not exist. Drulexen forced himself to speak. "Humans, you don't sleep like other species." Subject 3's lips curled slightly. "No." Drulexen's mind was unraveling, but he pushed forward. "You don't just rest. You don't just process memories. You." He hesitated, his hands clenching. "You go somewhere." The moment the words left his mouth, the darkness shifted. Not in sight, not in sound, in feeling. It listened. A presence stretched outward, vast and incomprehensible, pressing against the edges of their existence. It was not hostile, but it was aware. Watching. Studying. The humans had never been alone in their sleep. They had always been connected to something else. Drulexen's mind reeled. Every species in the galaxy saw sleep as a passive state, a necessity for biological recovery, a moment of vulnerability. But humans had turned it into something more. And now, the Vaxari had woken it. Vaylor's voice was almost a whisper. "What have we done?" Subject 3 finally moved. He reached out his hand, palm facing upward. The motion was slow, deliberate, and the space between them ripped open. A glimpse into something vast, something endless, a place where time had no meaning. A world built from the thoughts of dreamers, where nightmares and gods walked side by side. It wasn't just human minds that drifted in sleep. It was their souls. They had mapped this place, built in it, thrived in it. They had spent millennia crossing the threshold between waking and dreaming, shaping the space between into something no other species had ever dared to touch. And now, the Vaxari had forced them to fully cross that threshold. Drulexen felt something pulling, not physically, not even mentally. Something deeper, something in the very core of his being. The presence in the dark shifted, its unseen form pressing closer. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. "You do not belong here." Drulexen gasped, falling to his knees. The others did the same, clutching their heads, their bodies trembling under the sheer weight of the presence. Even Vaylor faltered, her breath shallow. Subject 3 lowered his hand, and the vision closed. The darkness faded, not completely, but enough for the pressure to lessen. Enough for them to breathe. The humans watched them in silence. Drulexen felt the truth settle deep into his bones. They had been studying humans, thinking they were the observers, the ones in control. But they had never been in control. Not of the experiment. Not of the ship. Not even of themselves. Vaylor lifted her gaze, her voice hoarse. "Are you going to kill us?" Subject 3's expression did not change, but his words were quiet. "You were never a threat." The weight of the statement crushed them. They had thought themselves superior, more advanced, more aware. But the humans had been beyond them from the very beginning. Trellickson closed his eyes. They had awakened something they could not begin to comprehend. And now, the only question left was whether they would be allowed to leave. Trellickson no longer knew if time was moving forward or if they were trapped in an endless moment of realization. The weight of what they had done pressed against his very essence. The humans had never been asleep in the way they had believed. They had been somewhere else. And now, the Vaxari had forced them to fully cross over. The ship was still there, yet it wasn't. The walls twisted, forming impossible angles, shifting between the physical and the unreal. The corridors stretched into infinity one moment and compressed into suffocating tunnels the next. It was as if the ship no longer existed in a single state, but flickered between realities, unable to decide which it belonged to. Vaylor forced herself to stand, her movements slow and deliberate. She kept her gaze locked on Subject 3, who remained at the center of the room, watching them with an expression that was neither anger nor pity. "You said we were never a threat," she rasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. The human didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then he spoke, and his voice was as calm as ever. "You are not." Trellickson clenched his hands. His mind was still reeling, still trying to piece together the impossible truth they had uncovered. "Then what are we to you?" The ship groaned, the shadows shifting again. Subject 3 finally moved, stepping forward, and with that single movement, the space around him rippled. The effect wasn't visible. It was something deeper, something that pressed against the mind rather than the eyes. The Vaxari felt it, the way reality itself adjusted to his presence. "You are children playing with fire," the human said softly, "and you have set the forest ablaze." Trellickson shuddered. Vaylor took a slow breath. "We didn't mean to." Subject 3's gaze was unreadable. "But you did." The presence in the dark stirred again. It was not hostile, but it was not passive either. It was aware. Curious. The humans had brought it fully into this world, and now it was watching, waiting. Vaylor straightened, summoning the last of her strength. "If we are children playing with fire, then tell us, how do we put it out?" Trellickson turned to her, eyes widening. Was she truly asking them for help, after everything they had done? But Subject 3 did not laugh. He did not mock her. He simply closed his eyes. The ship trembled. The shadows deepened. And then, for the first time since the nightmare had begun, the world shifted back. The corridors realigned. The walls solidified. The impossible geometry faded, replaced by the familiar metal of their ship. The unnatural warping ceased, and the gravity stabilized. The presence in the dark receded, not disappearing entirely, but withdrawing, as if slipping back into a place just beyond their perception. Trellickson inhaled sharply. He could feel it. The ship was real again. But the humans, they were more than real. Subject 3 opened his eyes. "We are returning to where we belong." Trellickson swallowed hard. "And us." The human's expression did not change. "You will be allowed to leave." Trellickson's body sagged with relief, but Subject 3 was not finished. "But you will not forget." The weight of those words settled over them like an unshakable truth. Vaylor met his gaze. "And if we do?" The human finally smiled. It was not comforting. It was understanding. "Then you will dream of us." The words sent a shiver through Trellickson's soul. The humans had no need for threats, no need for violence, because the Vaxari knew now. They understood, and they would never, ever forget.